All right, hello and welcome to the Empire Room. My name is Arthur Lupia and I'm the MPSA president. I appreciate you coming to the meeting and supporting the organization. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce John Mueller, who's our Empire Series speaker. It's great that he agreed to do this. This is a new format for the MPSA, and really what we're trying to do is create a space where you can see a high-quality presentation and in a way that you can think about it, interact with the speaker, and so forth. Professor Mueller is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have a Q&A for about 15 or 20 minutes after that. The session's being recorded. During the Q&A, I'll walk around with a wireless mic. If you have a question, let me come to you, and we'll get your question so that everyone can hear it. John Mueller is the Ralph D. Mershon Senior Research Scientist at the Mershon, am I pronouncing that correctly? Center for International Security Studies at The Ohio State University. He is also adjunct professor of political science at Ohio State and a Cato Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Professor Mueller is the author of the classic multiple prize-winning book analyzing public opinion during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, War, Presidents, and Public Opinion. More recently, he is the author of the new book, War and Ideas. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, has been a John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, and has received the International Studies Association's Susan Strange Award, as well as several teaching awards. Today, Professor Mueller is here to teach us why it's important to assess the process by which ideas are promoted and have come to be accepted or rejected in his talk, Assessing the Historical Movement of Ideas. It's my great privilege to welcome John Mueller.
Okay, thanks very much. Nice to be here in this occasion in this very nice room. I'd like to sort of muse for half an hour about the issue of ideas, an issue that I've been worried about in much of my career in various places. A lot of the issue is sort of summarized here by Robert Dahl, which you've been looking at for a while. What happens is that ideas and where they come from is very mysterious often. It's easier to ignore them in some respects and get on with analyzing things. And as Dahl suggests, frequently that can be a real problem. At any rate, I'd like to look at two ideas that have gained a lot of currency over the last couple of centuries. One is the idea of war aversion, and the other is the idea of democracy. And sort of look at them in that manner as sort of something that came out of the marketplace of ideas. But before getting to the marketplace of ideas, I think we ought to look at the marketplace. The marketplace itself is a very strange thing, and it seems to be the marketplace of ideas is a similarly strange thing. Ralph Waldo Emerson actually did not say, build a better mousetrap in the world to beat a path to your door. The mousetrap was actually invented after he died, the modern one at least. But it was but he did say something somewhat similar about church doors or something. But the idea is basically terribly naive. The idea is if you do something that's better than something that's out there, people will come and buy it. And basically, that's not true. You can get it out there. There's people spend their whole lives marketing products that are superior to other products, and no one buys them. And so that basic phenomenon is one I want to explore, dealing with other kinds of ideas as well. For example, in 1899, the first mousetrap, the modern mousetrap, was invented. Since that time, there's been 5,000 patents for mousetraps in the United States. Virtually none have made any money. At least some of those, following Emerson's supposed statement, must have been superior to the one that was invented in 1899, but it simply hasn't happened. So the point is, you can do everything you think is right, and people spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get products accepted, and no one shows up, no one buys them. Furthermore, the number of business startups that fail is about 90%. And among high-tech startups is about 95%. The reason for that, I think, is that it's a lot cheaper to have a high-tech startup. I mean, a real startup, like, even a modest thing, like starting a coffee shop or something like that, takes a fair amount of investment of time and particularly money. You have to remodel and so forth and get a lease and everything. Coming up with a high-tech startup doesn't take very often very much. All you have to do is a couple of people in a garage put things together and they put it out there. They've spent nothing except pretty much their own time on it. And so you get a lot more products going out there. In the case of ideas, it's even cheaper. You can spew out tons of ideas, and you can even get paid for it. You know, do an op-ed on some new idea, and you might get $200 or $300 for the op-ed, so you actually made a profit on simply putting the idea out. But that does not mean anybody's going to deal with it. There's also the matter of luck. And when you look at successful businesses, it's impressive how often luck is extremely important. Almost no one talks about luck. Danny Kahneman is about the only one, for example, in his recent book about decision making and about called Thinking Slow and Fast, or Fast and Slow, basically talks about luck quite a bit. And people in the stock market who are extremely successful, and then you figure out how more successful they'd be if they flipping coins, and you basically say they're not any more successful than if they've been flipping coins. Some people will flip 20 tails in a row. And so in looking at the history of a lot of businesses, it's a similar sort of thing. For example, I read a book on John D. Rockefeller, and he worked really hard. He was a very straightforward guy. He paid a lot of attention to detail. When he made a deal, you knew it was a deal. And he was very careful about the decisions he made and so forth. But the problem is that so were almost all his competitors. They did the same thing. They were making deals. They were taking some risk. They were being careful about it. They worked like crazy, frequently worked themselves into the grave, an early grave. And the difference seems to be mostly luck. In the case of Rockefeller, for example, his really big money came after he had retired, when someone else invented the internal combustion engine, which needed gasoline. Gasoline was a waste product of the petroleum industry he had come to control. He controlled the petroleum industry. The main thing was for kerosene lamps, but suddenly there's gasoline. Just a spectacular piece of luck. And so the name of the book is called Titan, and they call it about Rockefeller. And the question is, why is that a titan? That's a guy who he worked really hard just like everybody else, and the difference seems to be mostly in luck. You get things like this. I don't want to reduce everything to turning your baseball cap backward. But the question is, why do people wear their baseball caps backward now, even at the Chicago Cubs arena at Wrigley Field? When I grew up, and you did a school play, and you want to have somebody in who was really stupid, they would wear their baseball cap backward. Therefore, you knew they were really stupid because they didn't know how to put on a baseball cap. 20 years ago, suddenly, somehow that changed. So you have this guy doesn't even realize that he's sitting in the sun and could actually not have to use his hand, but simply turn around the baseball cap. So the question is, where did that idea come from? Who knows? The psychologists have never been able to figure out fads, why skirt lengths go up and down and so forth. People are always trying to sell stuff. They want you to buy this, want you to buy that, and so forth. So that's the perspective I basically want to come from. So let me turn to war aversion. This is a statement, yes, by Ernest Gellner. A great deal can happen without being necessary. For example, turning your baseball cap backwards, or slicing holes in your jeans. Somehow people say, hey, that's really cool. Really? There's a big change, a good documented change, very easy to document, in attitudes toward war before and after World War I. This is a statement from the military historian Michael Howard. War is considered to be acceptable, inevitable, and many people desirable way of settling differences. This is, for example, Immanuel Kant waxing eloquent about something he considered sublime, which was war. And talked about how a prolonged peace is disastrous. It brings debasing self-interest, cowardice, and effeminacy. And if you look at the literature before World War I, you can find zillions of people basically looking forward to the next war with a lot of glee. And the kinds of words and it's very easy. When I looked, it was the case, there's a book by a guy named Roland Stromberg called Redemption by War. And it's like 300 pages. He just collects. He doesn't do Prussian militarists. What he collects is statements by poets, artists, art critics, novelists, intellectuals, historians, and so forth. And these are the kinds of words they use for war. Beautiful, honorable, holy, sublime, heroic, ennobling, natural, virtuous, glorious, cleansing, manly, necessary, progressive, and redemptive. For peace, they find it characterized by materialism, artistic decline, effeminacy, selfishness, immorality, stagnation, frivolity, cowardice, boredom, sensuality, corruption, and utter emptiness and death. Now, I can give you literally hundreds of these quotes if you want. You could look at the equivalent of Foreign Affairs in 1890, and you'll find articles talking about God's purpose by war and so forth. It's very easy to find. It's Emile Zola. I'll just give you a few. Carl Pearson, the guy who invented the Pearson product moment correlation coefficient. Igor Stravinsky, a German historian. John Ruskin, a art critic. War is the foundation of all the high virtues and faculties of men. It's associated not with peace is not associated with loving, plenty, and civilization, but peace is associated with sensuality, selfishness, corruption, and death. And German general Alexis de Tocqueville, a minister, Nietzsche, and J. Cram, a British historian. Universal peace would be a world sunk in bovine content. Okay, that was there very commonly at the time, and these are statements by 5 historians and political scientists talking about how things changed after World War I. Using the same technique, basically sort of a crude kind of content analysis, I looked really hard to find anybody, including generals and stuff, who said what I just repeated, given you some indication of after the war. It's almost impossible to find. I found like 1 or 2 cases of people saying that. How glorious and wonderful and uplifting and noble war was. Now, so what you have clearly is a major change of ideas, which I think is very consequential. And you can try to explain it. There's various ways of why there's this big change at World War I. One of the things that happened was that in 1890, before World War I, for the first time in history, there was a organized anti-war movement. There'd never been in all of history an organized anti-war movement. There had, a popular one with people, writing books and talking about it and holding seminars and stuff like that. And there'd been individual pacifists. There are obviously pacifist groups like the Quakers and so forth. Jesus was a pacifist in some ways, so the idea is Spinoza and so forth, Erasmus. And so there are various people saying war is a really dumb thing. But as an organized movement, it didn't happen, and I don't quite know why, in 1889. A French aristocrat, I'm not a French, an Austrian aristocrat named Bertha von Suttner wrote a book, an incredibly bad novel called Lay Down Your Arms. And immediately, and no one had written a book particularly like this before, and it basically talks about how disgusting war is. So it's quite a good piece of propaganda, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, with which it has been compared. The first part is just sort of a story about a young woman and her husband and so forth, and they're trying. And then he's in the military. And about page 80 or so, the woman, who's the wife, visits him not on the battlefield but after the battlefield, and she just starts describing what it looks like: people dying from shock. People with their arms hanging off, people bleeding slowly to death, people going crazy. The only happy creatures are dogs because there's so many dead horses and corpses to eat. And so it just goes on and on and on like this. Now, this is hardly any news, but it really struck a responsive chord, one of those phrases which doesn't tell you much about anything. But it became a colossal bestseller throughout the Western world, translated to like 30 languages and so forth. And she became sort of the center of this movement. She, around her, gathered a bunch of other people. There were things, there are the 4 things I have there in the upper right. They're the moralists, people who are against war because they thought it was bad, evil, like the Quakers. Her position is basically, it's disgusting, it's barbaric. We don't do that anymore. And people said, what do you mean? We've been doing it forever. It's in the Bible. And then she would say, yeah, but so is slavery in the Bible, and that's been around forever. And so you'd have this kind of argument. And then so she had basically an aesthetic thing. And then Norman Angell, a journalist, wrote a book that came out in 1909 called The Grand Illusion. And his argument was that, by the way, the peace movement now is really growing. It's a small gadfly movement, but it's really noticeable. They're holding peace conferences. She's able to get Alfred Nobel to create the Nobel Peace Prize, and she later gets it herself. The Tsar of Russia is sort of seems to be complicit in some ways, though that seems somewhat phony. He's trying to gain some political advantage. But anyway, you're having fairly large number of people. The president of Stanford University, Jordan, very much part of this movement. Now, Angel has this book in which he says war is futile, that basically you can make a lot more money by trading than by conquest, or winning wars. And even though this peace movement isn't going on, even though Bert von Suttner had this big bestseller, he couldn't get anybody to publish it. They'd say, well, go find a Quaker publisher. So he eventually published it privately himself under a different title, Europe's Optical Illusion, and it became this colossal bestseller. Why? The publishers obviously would publish it, and they did after it became a bestseller, because he had a new edition virtually every year. But it came sort of out of nowhere. Meanwhile, however, there's a persistence of war enthusiasm. So it seems to me what you had dealing with the issue of ideas is there's no particular reason to expect it to come out at this time. The wars that had previously been around were quite small, with the possible exception of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Most of them, wars between Prussia and Denmark, or Prussia and Austria and so forth. And so it wasn't that there was a big horror of war out there, but these became popular. Nonetheless, the overwhelming opinion was from the kind of thing I gave you initially. Everybody saying this is a really bad thing. This is a really wonderful thing, and these pacifists are, out to destroy one of the great, wonderful, magnificent, sublime institutions. So you had a lot of anti-pacifism coming out. Okay, World War I came, and after that, as I've already mentioned, this idea was in. Everybody was now a pacifist, as far as you could see, including people who had never been in that group before that. So they have the League of Nations and various things. We got to get rid of war. The war was fought. An early slogan in the war from H.G. Wells was, this will be the war to end war. And that was the thing that people wanted to do. You can explain this the obvious thing to explain it is with World War I is very destructive. However, it's not really all that much more destructive than an awful lot of other wars that had taken place previously that never really caused people to turn against war. And furthermore, people tended to think some old wars, like the 30 Years' War, were even more destructive than they actually had been. So it doesn't really matter how destructive the 30 Years' War was, but if people thought that like 80% of the population died, that's the relevant thing, even if it's not true. And there were huge exaggerations of the destruction of previous wars and what Genghis Khan did and so forth. So it wasn't terribly unusual in that respect, though it was obviously horrible. Some people argue there was a literary war. It was the first time you had poets and stuff in the trenches. Other people argued that there was the economic development was really pretty important. That what happened was there was this long period of time, unprecedented in human history, in which there was, particularly in Europe, well, if I can give you the numbers right there, the GDP per capita in US dollars, the Western Europe is the second line down there, was really growing during that period of time. And of course, it continued very much so into the 20th century. And so there was that. But as this was happening, war enthusiasm continued. And furthermore, a war that was really catastrophic, which was the American Civil War, did not cause, including in the United States, a sense of war aversion. They certainly didn't like the horrors of the Civil War, but it didn't turn people against war per se. There's also argued that people said because of gas, for example, the next war will be total world annihilation. But that argument it basically came from the other direction. What happened was people who wanted to get rid of war argued that the next war would be the end of the world in order to get people to be against war. It wasn't so much that the destructiveness caused them to be against war, it was the other way around. The war aversion caused them to talk about these annihilation possibilities. So the only thing that's unique, completely unique, about World War I, and obviously you can have an interplay of these factors and so forth, is the rise of the pre-war peace movement. There'd never been anything like that before at all, before any war. And so in many respects, the ideas were out there, the way I would look at it. These ideas came out of nowhere. Bert von Suttner writes this terrible novel, and everybody seems to want to read it. Angel comes out with this thing about economics, and suddenly it's a huge bestseller. Why? The publishers didn't think it would be a bestseller. And so these ideas are sort of gurgitating around, and then the war comes, and suddenly everybody accepts it. Is that obvious that they would accept those ideas? Not particularly. But I think it's really extremely important development. What we're getting now, by the way, it sort of reminds me of this. Hardly anybody knows about this war, this difference, the attractiveness in which war was held before World War I. Now, for example, right now we're getting the Putin thing. And so there's a lot of people talking about, well, is this like before World War I, et cetera? And nobody says an obvious difference. This is not necessarily dispository, as the lawyers would say, but an obvious difference between now and before 1914 is the one I've already indicated. No one is going around saying, hot dog, let's have a war because it'll just be sublime. And so that, but the change of ideas is something that people don't talk about. They say, well, there's economic interdependence and things like that, though there was plenty of that before World War I as well. Okay, so it seems to me that that's one example. The other thing I'd like to talk about, and now, of course, this has continued. World War II, needless to say, happened, though I think, and I'd be glad to talk about this more if you want, that without Adolf Hitler, it would not have happened. He was as also probably with the Holocaust, if Hitler hadn't been run over by a truck, or if he had been shot, killed, rather than the guy marching next to him at the beer hall putsch in the 1920s, I think World War II never would have happened. There was no one, as William Manchester says, he was the only one that wanted war. There was nobody in Germany that wanted to expand to the east big time. There were some people that sort of thought that's a pretty good idea, but not very many. And on top of that, you'd also have to be willing to risk a big war to do so. No one was like that. And also you'd have to have the political skills to pull it off. And there was nobody in the Nazi regime besides Hitler who had those political skills and abilities. He was also extremely lucky. At any rate, we've now slumped into obviously a bovine contentment period in Europe. And Brad DeLong, the economist at Berkeley, points out that if you want to find out how far back in history do you have to go before you reach a period in which the Rhine remained uncrossed for such a long time by an army with hostile intent, you have to go back 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years. Okay, so that's my war story. Let me give you the democracy story, which also I'm trying to do a take on it in which lots of mysterious things happen in various ways. Let me get my... and sort of the way of looking at sort of the historical movement of ideas tends to cause other questions to come out. What happens is that when something happens, a new idea takes place, it's not too hard to try to explain it, why it happened. Just as I tried to explain why World War I seems to have been a big change. It's obviously arguable, but you have something to work with and you certainly know what happened. But it's incredibly difficult to predict it, what ideas will take fire. Let me give you an example on that, and then I'll go to democracy. Not many years ago, the CD, this compact disc, was invented, and it was put on the market. Okay, so why would anybody buy a compact disc? Well, the sound quality, particularly in the early CDs, was clearly worse than vinyl. Secondly, they cost more. So no one would buy them, right? Well, it became a huge consumer, except, people, it became extremely popular. Why? Well, the only thing I can think of is, they like the size. Instead of this big platter, you have this little tiny thing that's kind of shiny and everything. And I don't think the manufacturers thought about that too much, but anyway, it is. And the other thing, there isn't any surface noise. Well, who cares about surface noise? If you have a good LP player, a vinyl player, there isn't any surface noise except at the very beginning. There's a 9/10 of a second of scritch, 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 and then you get the music. So people like CDs because they didn't have to go through the torture of listening to 9/10 of a second of scritch, 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 apparently. So you can explain that backwards. But before the hand, who knows? Okay, somewhat along that line, let's talk about monarchy. This is a good place to talk about it because this is the kind of thing that you'd have over monarchs. This is like in the Tsar's box at the Bolshoi Theater. The Tsar would sit there right in the middle of things with his light shining down on him. democracy, why did it take so long for democracy to start to rise? Everybody knew about democracy thousands of years ago. Obviously the Greeks and so forth, it's a Greek word, origins. And it basically didn't, it took until basically 1800 or so before it really started to become a meaningful thing. Why? What's impressive is not that, I mean, you can say democracy, I think you could argue pretty objectively, democracy is a superior form of government. But the question is, and particularly when the choice is between that and monarchy. In other words, it doesn't take much to be better than a monarchy. Monarchy is a really stupid system. What you do is you get somebody who's king, sits there, and for the whole rest of his life, everything he does has to be right. Now, you may get a pretty good king for a while, but is he going to stay that way? Has he got sycophants and flatterers around him? And then if you get hereditary monarchy, it's even more bizarre. You think just because this guy might be a pretty good king, his son, his eldest son, not any son, but it has to be the eldest son, is going to be a good king too? I mean, it's a bizarre thing. Even if you had a little teeny kind of democracy, like suppose what you did is the king would appoint an electorate of about 14 people, elders, who could only do one thing. If he did something that was really outrageous, they could fire him. For example, having his horse elected to the Senate. Even that would be better. That'd be a little tiny, 14 members electorate or selectorate, but that would be better. So you'd think that the monarchy, people would say, this is a really dumb system. I recently saw Shakespeare's, a couple of Shakespeare's plays, particularly Richard II, and also Winter's Tale, which has this absolute monarch in top, and basically he can do anything he wants. In the case of Richard II, he bankrupts the country. He does really stupid things from the standpoint of himself and the standpoint of the country, and everybody just sort of said, well, God's talking through him. He thinks he's talking for God. He thinks he is God. So how can he possibly make a mistake? In Winter's Tale, a comparative comedy, sort of, the king becomes convinced that his wife, the queen, has been having an affair with his best friend, and he basically kills her, except that she's pregnant, so after the baby is born, the baby has to be killed because, of course, he's not the father, and so forth, based on no evidence whatever. And most people just stand around, they grouse a little, and they complain, sire, please think this a little bit further, but basically, it's just sort of a crazy system. Okay, well, it seems to me one reason for this is basically the Plato idea, that Plato very brilliantly came up with a real reason why you couldn't have democracy. Because if you had democracy, everybody would be equal, everybody would have an equal weight, and so there's a lot more poor people than rich people, so the poor people would combine together and they would take the money from the rich people. So therefore, rich people had a big incentive not to go to have democracy. That's a brilliant idea, and it's very, very persuasive, and it just happens to be wrong. The only way you would know that it was wrong was actually to market test democracy, and I think that's what happened with the United States. For the first time, basically, in a large country particularly, democracy was actually tried, and they didn't call it market testing, but they called it the American experiment. We're going to try this over big space. At that time, news and communications didn't travel any faster than they had in the days of the Greeks, before telegraph, obviously, and things like that. So they tried the American experiment, and very gradually they didn't let everybody vote, but eventually they got down to the hoi polloi and sort of expanding, and didn't seem to make much difference. The rich still were running the country, basically, though they were now elected. So you had basically a market testing, and more people said, well, it actually does sort of work, very surprisingly, because Plato's argument is so profoundly convincing. It just happens to be wrong. Then what you also had with democracy was a real setback, because the French Revolution and the terror that came after it must have been incredibly convincing to a lot of people, saying that's what Plato was talking about, except it's worse. They're not only stealing your money, but they're killing you at the guillotine. Somehow, democracy sort of survived that. It also survived the American Civil War. Let me read you something by Tocqueville. This is in the 1848 appropriate year edition of Democracy in America, in which Europe was at that time in quite a bit of turmoil over liberalism and other things. And he called the United States the most stable of all the nations on earth, because while all the nations of Europe have been devastated by war or torn by civil discord, the American people alone in the civilized world have remained at peace. That was, of course, basically true. And then 10 years later, 12 years later, the United States tore itself apart. It was incapable, its democracy was incapable of solving a key problem peacefully, and 600,000 people were dead. Somehow it survived that. And I think you can see that in Lincoln's the most famous speech about democracy ever by Lincoln. He says, after this war, what we must have is a new birth of freedom in order the democracy, that is to say, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish not only from the United States, but from the earth. If we don't get it right, I mean, it's sort of typical American arrogance there, but at any rate, basically, if we don't let it happen, it won't happen by itself. Okay, then there's also a matter of luck. World War I basically destroyed monarchy in Europe. World War II destroyed fascism. By 1975, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was very depressed. We have these periods in democracy. Moynihan said, democracy increasingly tends to the condition of monarchy in the 19th century, a holdover form of government, one which persists in isolated or peculiar places here and there, but has simply no relevance to the future. Beginning in as he's saying that, in order to cheer him up, the world started to become massively democratic. The third, what Sam Huntington has called the third wave in his book from 1991, started in Southern Europe, and then, of course, spread through Latin America. It's very hard to explain why in 1975 that happened. I mean, Huntington in the book tries to do it, and most of his explanations are basically idea-oriented. The Pope changed his mind about things. That Gorbachev changed his mind later on. That there was modeling or demonstration effect. People wanted to be like the United States. The United States had tried to foist democracy on Latin America many times, particularly under Woodrow Wilson. Now, starting in 1975, everybody said, hey, monarchy, military dictatorship isn't where it's at anymore. Democracy is where it's at. And with remarkably little bloodshed, huge numbers of military dictatorships, the standard form of government in Latin America, died out. The Cold War also obviously helped with communism declining, and a really quite remarkable improvement in East Europe, embracing democracy quite a bit. We may be turning back now, people argue, with Putinism and so forth. One of the things that's happened in Ukraine is a lot of people seem to think that democracy hasn't given us anything except crooks in Ukraine, and there may be failure there. But anyway, it seems to me that looking at it in this way, it's somewhat of a nihilistic argument that I'm doing. And that's why I think a lot of people don't like it, including me. But it really seems that it's very hard to be able to predict how ideas are going to change. And ideas seem to be extremely important and consequential. But the best way to solve the problem is to ignore them. And just sort of the rise of ideas, the attractiveness of ideas, but because you can't really predict them in any important way, it seems to me. Okay, let me conclude on that, and we can kick my ideas or me around if you want. Thanks a lot.
For Professor Mueller. We're going to have this so you can just be heard on that, be heard by everyone. So some ideas have been put forth. Maybe some of yours have changed. Okay? You could use that experience as, okay? I'll come to you. Do you have a question?
Yes.
Maybe you could introduce yourself.
John Ben, Heidelberg University. It would seem that at various periods in world history, such as after, say, the American Revolution, there was a considerable change in things like primogeniture and others, which many people attribute to the fact that in a period where change is become acceptable, and where those people who were not partisan to the change have lost status, that it is possible for people to discard those things which they had already more or less lost confidence in or no longer had useful economic value. Can you comment?
Yeah, well, that's maybe a perfectly good argument. It's one that comes after the fact, though. And that's the way you end up basically explaining this, like with the CD recording. We know it's a success, and there must be certain characteristics of this that are popular with people. or they're now primed to accept it because of something else that's going on.
It's a time when people are willing to say the emperor has no clothes, because up until that time, it was you gained better status in a society when you accepted the status quo. That was part of what your identity was as a respectable person.
Yeah, it may have contributed. It was certainly the case that in the rise of the early United States, that they knew that they did not want to have a monarch. So it was rebellion in that sense. And they're trying something different. They also knew that it was an experiment, that no one had really tried it before. And they may have been more daring because of that, and they basically lucked in. They turned out they came to a superior system. So it's just that it's hard. The problem is basically trying to predict this rather than trying to explain it after it takes place. That's my problem on this.
Our next question is from Cato from University of Houston.
Yeah, in the last issue of Rolling Stone, eminent political thinker Gene Simmons, bass player for KISS, praised the United States' involvement in Vietnam and praised the decision makers who got us there. In your field, in international relations, is there a revisionist movement to defend the United States' involvement in Vietnam? And what would be the intellectual foundation of that particular argument?
Not that I know tell. It's certainly not the case that democracy doesn't make mistakes and do really stupid things. It's very hard to find anybody who's. Reagan did a little bit back, to say nice things about Vietnam as a noble effort and so forth. But I don't think that effort has much legs, shall we say.
Professor Mueller, I've just been reading his new book, The Sixth Extinction. Some of you heard about it. It's Culver's book. What she describes is this process in which everyone kind of knows the answers beforehand for a long time, but there's like this long train of resistance to the new idea beforehand. And I was thinking of Appiah's book, and I've just been reading it, The Honor Code. People knew for a long time that dueling or foot binding or slavery was wrong. The ideas have been there for a long time. What is it in us, this force that keeps us from hitting the new idea, where when the ideas are already out there for the longest time? And the Sixth Extinction is actually, not only does it read like a detective story, which is a fascinating read, the Sixth Extinction, which she argues, and I think many scientists argue, we're kind of enduring now. The idea is that it's all right around us, in front of us, but we're not picking up on it. And she takes us through the previous scientific transformations that went through to that point, like how long it took to accept evolution and Darwin. And yet the ideas were right there in front of people for the longest time. There's something that must be a trigger, a moment or something, because then when the idea hits, as you've described, it seems like watersheds begin to take place.
Yeah, well, I agree. But the question is, slavery had been around for an extremely long time.
Forever.
And it had been in every corner of the world, as war had been. And so what you get is, it's basically 100 years before this peace movement started, there was a meeting in Manchester, England, in which suddenly there was a whole bunch of people saying, let's get rid of slavery. And it was an idea whose time had come. It gradually grew, and it's very hard to see why slavery died out for any reason except people decided it wasn't a good idea. For example, obviously you'd say it died out if it were not economically profitable. But as Stanley Angerman, one of the major slave historians, or historians of slavery, has pointed out, no slave owner ever gave up slaves for economic reasons. So it's not in a good economic. In fact, the Atlantic slave trade was booming in the 19th century. So economically, it made a whole lot of sense. And it was just basically people saying, it's like the war thing. I mean, the comparison is really pretty good, because Bertha von Suttner couldn't really say, we're killing each other by the hundreds of thousands or millions or something. Children and women are suffering and so forth. The only wars that were in Europe, they were talking mainly about European wars, of course, that was their context, not wars in Africa or in the Far East or something. She couldn't say that. She'd just say, this is disgusting. Think about these people bleeding to death for what? And it caught on. Now, it had been disgusting forever. I mean, war has always looked like that. Homer is not exactly remiss in talking about the agonies of it. And any sort of war veteran can tell you about, say, dysentery, for example, forever. So the question is, why did it come at that time? And they didn't, in the case of slavery, there's a certain thing like the Quakers are moving in that direction. The Quakers actually gave up their slaves before that took place, not for economic reasons, but for moral reasons or religious reasons. And so maybe that started people setting that way, but why? And why didn't it happen? Why didn't it happen 2,000 years earlier? Why didn't it wait another 100 years? It just, if you could find something really, if the GDP reaches this level, then people automatically think democracy is great or something, and you say, okay, that's cause and effect. What I'm arguing is, and that's terrific. You can do that, and basically you can predict totally. But basically, these things seem to be really mysterious, like the 45 LPs.
And it's not just the material and economic and power interests that always drive everything. It's an idea that someone catches fire.
Yeah, well, the idea sort of comes out. In the case of World War I, you could say, well, this was the catalyst. For example, people said, yeah, war really is terrible. And so all these people have been saying war is bad, now we ought to get on the bandwagon, and they certainly did. But it's certainly possible to imagine that they would have said, well, we did that with Napoleon, we did that with Genghis Khan, we did that with 30 Years' War, time was on, and war was going to be there forever, we should try to maybe get them a bit under control, or something. At the same time, Norman Angell says, if World War I hadn't happened, he felt, and it's quite a reasonable conclusion, he felt that we were really, what he calls, there's a mood building. We were gradually gaining adherence and so forth. And so consequently, even if World War I hadn't taken place, we would have gradually captured the day, like with slavery. I mean, there wasn't any, the Americans had a civil war, but mostly it was a matter of sort of gradual development. And it took 100 years, almost exactly, in fact, exactly 100 years, exactly after 100 years after the first meeting that sort of triggered this in Manchester, Brazil got rid of it. Its slave system was the first major slave system in what was then known as Christendom. So in 100 years, the ideas changed. They didn't seem to come from economics. They didn't come from religion, because you get the Bible. I mean, God tells the Israelites to take slaves. If He doesn't tell them to kill them all, so the religious argument loses flat down unless you reinterpret religion. And it happened, and in 100 years, a master institution, slavery, was basically obliterated. Now, in many respects, certainly within Europe, over 100 years, a master institution, war, has been obliterated essentially. But we'll have to see if Putin changes that. But again, it's a thing. It's an idea. War is an idea. Democracy is an idea. And slavery is an idea. Only ideas. I guess that's probably my bottom line message. That these things are merely ideas. They aren't necessities. If they were, Switzerland would be going crazy because they hadn't fought a battle since 98. And so you can live with war. You can live without it. You can live with slavery. You can live without it. You don't need it. And if you decide you don't want to do that anymore, you can do that. And it's very unpleasant, because I'd really like to say, Chris, these three things happen, and automatically you get this. And so that's why I said at the beginning my argument is somewhat nihilistic, because it basically said you can't explain these things very well unless you get inside the neurons or something who have the idea. Any more you can explain the guy with the backward baseball bat, or the sliced up cheese.
The next question is from Nigel Ashford from the Institute for Humane Studies.
Thanks very much. Are you familiar with the work of Deirdre McCloskey, who's trying to explain the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism? And she looked at all the alternative explanations and comes to the conclusion it's all about rhetoric, it's all about language, it's all about words, which would tend to support your ideational explanation of change. The only thing is, I think ideational changes, or views, tends to emphasize a top-down approach, that it's a change at the intellectuals at the top that leads to a change. Whereas I think Deirdre, she emphasizes it was a change of language among, if you like, quote, ordinary people, moving from a view where being a business person was somehow a bad thing, to where in fact it was a virtuous thing. So I don't know whether you want to comment on Deirdre's
Yeah,
work. If you can
yeah, I know her quite well. She's a good friend. She's somewhat like Steve Pinker in the sense of what she's tracing all these sort of parallel developments. And my interpretation, I did a book called Capitalism, Democracy, and Ralph's Pretty Good Grocery, is that capitalism really triumphed when there was an innovation in the 19th century. It's partly in her work as well, in which they discovered that honesty was the best policy. They discovered that keeping your word was a good idea. They discovered that bargaining, so that as if you never expected to see the other bargainer again, was exactly what you get. In other words, what they began to have is a long-term perspective. The best way to get rich is to have repeat customers and not alienate the customers, be honest with them. And that was a revolution that took place in the 19th century. Alfred Marshall, the economic historian, the first one really, was writing about that in the 1890s. He said, there's so many places you can cheat now because it's a big economy, but no one's cheating, or, hardly. In the case of the top-down, bottom-up, I do tend to see it as a bottom-up thing. In other words, what people are constantly doing is putting on ideas, like the CDs. And then if someone buys them, they follow up on them. So the ideas are there, but they're not being manipulated. They, if anything, are manipulating the decision makers. So that's why you open a restaurant, you hope people will show up, and if they don't, you're out of business. If you come out with Laserdisc as opposed to DVD, no one seems to want to buy it, even though it's superior than the alternative by far. And that's what 90% of all these businesses fail, because they are not able to attract the customers, even though they may have a superior product in some sense, and even if they do all the right kind of marketing and everything. So I tend to see more in that respect. But I agree with her, basically, that in the sense that it's bottom up. Ultimately, the customers decide, and certainly in the capitalist system, and also in an idea system. If people don't buy the idea, it's the end of it.
Okay, the next question is from Thomas Barrieri from the University of Missouri.
Thank you. I'm wondering about your idea in regards to the possibility of this being some sort of random idea that catches hold, and then the reason that it progresses is because there's some sort of benefit for it. And the reason I bring it up is the example that you give with the baseball cap is essentially a classic example of what evolutionists Richard Dawkins and Susan Blackmore would call a meme, which is this idea that there are these ideas called memes, which is a plan of genes, which end up being transferred from throughout society, transferred from culture to culture. And the way that they work is they just kind of spring up and take hold because there's some sort of benefit, the same way a genetic mutation ends up passing along through a species because of a benefit vis-a-vis natural selection. And I'm wondering about the idea that these ideas could just kind of spring up, and hundreds of them could spring up all the time, but the reason that they take hold is just because there happens to be some sort of benefit for a culture, such as democracy being more beneficial than war to us as a species. And it's really just kind of a random luck of the draw, I guess you could say genetic mutation or idea mutation that takes place, which then kind of just works its way through a culture and works its way down the line.
Yeah, it's hard to, the issue is that why did it happen at one time and not another? Why? There's certainly been plenty of bad ideas. I mean, this guy's going to get, skin cancer, right? How is the species being improved by him getting skin cancer at the age of 25 years in the Chicago Cubs stadium? The idea of slicing your genes was the idea of wearing high heels. I mean, come on, is that helping the species? It just turns, it becomes cool. In the case of war, I mean, people have certainly known the destruction and the horrors, the widows of, it goes on forever, obviously, about the loss of life in war. And until the 19th century, there wasn't an organized movement of people saying, let's not do war anymore. So they knew it was a bad thing. It obviously didn't help the species go. I mean, the best way to keep the species growing is don't kill each other. Nonetheless, it never happened before, even though there have been individuals who said it, and some individual groups like the Quakers. So what I have a problem with is it's almost like saying there's an idea whose time has come, you know, except you put it in the meme category. I don't see how that really, you know, solves the problem.
The next question is from Grant Johnson from Cal State University, Los Angeles.
Thank you. Obviously, some philosophers, especially like Hegel and such, have argued that ideas in history are progressive, ultimately going
Ideas are what?
are progressive, ultimately developing towards some ultimate normative goal. Do you think there's any validity to those kind of ideas?
No. I wouldn't judge them in that sense. I mean, in Nazism, it was not exactly progressive, and it almost took over the world in the 30s. Communism, one of the great bad ideas of all time, was dominant for, you know, not dominant, but a major player in the whole bloody literally 20th century. So you get some really bad ideas out there, and sometimes they're really grasped. So I don't see it necessarily as progressive. Obviously, it depends on your values too. Obviously, you love war, then the getting rid of war is definitely not progressive. It's regressive. We're getting away from something that's glorious and wonderful. Progressive, and also, let's take another idea, abortion. Pinker tries to talk about this a little bit in his book. I'll be going to a conference with him over the weekend, in fact, and also Dawson will be there. And the issue is now, what we've done, we've gotten rid of capital punishment a lot. You know, it's very rare. We got rid of war, got rid of slavery, got rid of cruel and unusual punishment, got rid of infanticide, got rid of sacrifice to God and so forth, human sacrifice. But we've also got now abortion, which kills 1 million fetuses a year in the United States alone. And that's widely accepted. And you can obviously not consider that to be murder, but lots of people do. I'm neither opposed to abortion nor am I a Catholic, but the thing is, I'm very uncomfortable with abortion, obviously. So it's 1 million people are being killed, or fetuses, pre-people, and all around the world. And so is that progressive? I mean, if you value more the choice of the mother, okay, but it's killing something that could be alive, could be a person. Now, if suppose something changed now, and they said, okay, we're not going to do abortions anymore, but we're going to, if a woman doesn't want to bear the child, then the fetus will be removed, raised in a test tube, and then raised in a state, orphanage. And in that basically is work. I can imagine some countries doing that, like Denmark. There's large numbers of Danes that get conceived, but not enough that actually get born. And so they're actually doing things to try to, they're giving public holidays for anybody who was conceived on Christmas or something like that. I don't know. They're trying to encourage people to have babies. In other words, not abort, or not use birth control, but in the case of abortion. So suppose you got that in the future. And in other words, the babies would not be killed, the fetuses would not be killed, but instead the woman's desire not to bear the baby would be honored, but the baby would grow up and be raised in an orphanage, become a Dane. And I think at that time people look back and say how bizarre and barbaric abortion was. It was basically infanticide, high-tech infanticide. So there's an idea I'm obviously very uncomfortable with, and Pinker has problems dealing with it himself in the book, because it seems to be sort of retrogressive in the sort of liberalization of getting rid of violence, and then it's not a trivial thing. 1 million people in the United States alone are murdered, if you use the anti-abortion rhetoric, every year. And we just accept that. Maybe I do as well, but it's whether you want to call that progressive or something is very, very strange. And as I say, it may be in the future that there'll be essentially a way of avoiding that problem with the thing. Obviously, technologically, it's more or less possible, probably even now, but say 25, 50 years from now, it'll be probably very easy. And maybe you don't like orphanages, but it's better than killing the fetus before it's born. So, anyway, it's that kind of moral dilemma. And the fact that abortion, when at one time, Planned Parenthood was totally opposed to abortion as a way of birth control. And then after 73 and so forth, of course, they now embrace it. But at that time, there was some places where it was legal, like Japan before that. And so what you've had is a change of acceptance, which, wide acceptance of a form of infanticide, even though the old kind of infanticide is no longer tolerated. So it's an idea that came in, and there's a lot of people who think it's a very bad idea, obviously, the anti-abortion people, for religious or other reasons, exactly the same kind of reasons that people who opposed war, opposed capital punishment, and other ideas in which people end up dead. But it's a liberal type people who are mostly embracing it. So,
The last question will go to Steve Gottlieb of Albany Law.
I didn't know I was the last question, but anyway, I've been trying to understand whether your argument is that we haven't figured out the explanation or that there is none. And the example that's been running through my head maybe can be argued both ways, but it seems like the quintessential example of the spread of an idea is the creation of a religion. But there are clearly at least geographical patterns, and I'm not just thinking about Palestine, I'm actually thinking about an area in New York where a lot of religions in this country have been spawned, which suggests something more than, just throwing it out and it hitting the right.
yeah. Well, there's been predictions that religion would die out for a long time. And it has in most of Western Europe, in the sense of being a really important part of your life and so forth. You still go to church, you get married, and things like that. The argument against getting rid of religion, first of all, was that if we don't have religion, we won't be able to explain the world, because everything's in the Bible. Well, science basically ended that thing. But then they continue to think if we get rid of religion, people will no longer be moral. Because if they don't believe there's a God who's going to punish them for doing bad things, then they won't behave right. So even atheists would say, well, yeah, we've got to have that as a social control thing. But now Western Europe has obviously developed. You can have perfectly reasonable, humane, productive, vibrant societies without religion being any part of it. So religion obviously is not necessary for morality. It's not necessary for science to figure out how things happen. In fact, it's a really bad idea to do that, though that was popular for centuries. So it is everywhere, but so is slavery everywhere, so is war everywhere. And you can imagine it dying out. And people in the 19th century, the post-Darwinians, for example, if they knew that there was still that much religion left over, 150 years later in the United States, they'd be amazed. But of course, it has died out in a lot of other areas. So it's an idea that something that people apparently don't really need, because Danes don't seem to need it. Even Italians don't seem to need it anymore. So it can go away. In terms of the first thing about explaining it, I imagine you can explain any idea by, if you're able to get inside the neutrons or something, neurons rather, I guess it would be, and so forth. But it seems to be very difficult to predict it, to be able to explain it before the fact otherwise. You can explain it, you can explain it once it happens, like the World War I thing. You can go back and say, why did this idea change? The ideas really did change, and finding out, but that's after the fact. And it actually happened, so historians do that all the time, trying to trace the pattern changes of ideas. There's also if I really knew how to predict what people will want 5 years from now, or 3 years from now, or 10 years from now, I wouldn't be here at all in springy Chicago. I'd be on Wall Street. And within 2 weeks, I'd be the richest person in the world. People are doing that all the time, trying to figure out what people are going to want, what product they're going to want, what ideas they're going to want, and they simply can't do it. So if you get a real science of it, you could be very rich very quickly, if you could really do it with precision. Good.
Okay, I'd like to express some gratitude. First, for those of you, thank you for coming. This is a new venture for the Midwest Political Science Association, trying to create a moment where we can see fantastic talk presented very well and give you an opportunity to interact with the speaker. If you enjoyed the Empire series, please by all means tell the people who are attending, and please let the Midwest Political Science Association know, because the question is, should we do more things like this? The other gratitude I'd like to express is to Professor Mueller's fantastic talk and Q&A, and thank you so much for helping us out.